A warm welcome to everyone to this series of reflections on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ under the overall title, What Jesus Meant. Today, I am doing this reflection, this session with you in the ambience of the Advent season. And therefore, I thought it would be appropriate to share some general reflections on some of the universal patterns embedded in the circumstances of the birth of Jesus Christ. First of all, I have to say that the idea that Jesus was born on the 25th of December is an arbitrary assumption. I do not want to go into the historical details of how Constantine, the Roman emperor, zeroed on this date. But what I do want to emphasize is that this ambiguity about the precise date on which the life of Jesus Christ began on our earth has its own spiritual nuances. I will not go into those reflections today because that would make this session more compendious than it needs to be. So, first of all, let me state as simply as I can how I understand the human significance of Jesus' life and mission. To me, Jesus symbolizes the quintessence of life. That is to say, if all the cultural, temporal, racial, linguistic, class, caste, stratifications, all these arbitrary elements are removed from the mysterious phenomenon of life, what will be that quintessence of life left? The quintessence that's common to humanity all over the world in all ages and climes, beyond all variations, diversities, differences, etc. That quintessence of life is represented in Jesus Christ, and that's a sense in which I understand the meaning of the verse, Jesus is the light of life. Jesus as the light of life means that he represents that absolute, irreducible quintessence of life, which is therefore universal, necessarily universal. And therefore, he belongs to the essence of the human condition. For example, if you look at any form of life and every form of life, you will find that it is connected to light. Remove light from the world altogether and life will disappear. So that's how Jesus is the light of life. Now, what we're going to do in this session is to see how the universal human condition or condition of human existence on earth is reflected in the life and work of Jesus Christ, and particularly today, the circumstances of his birth. So I had to say this much way of fixing the framework for our thinking together. Now, the first thing I want to say is that the life of the life of Jesus Christ, in terms of the circumstances of his birth, and that's the most obvious thing we can see. The life of Jesus Christ is encircled with peril, with danger. Now, Jesus could have died at any point in time. Jesus could have been aborted. I'm sure that if Mary were to be our contemporary, should have been forced to do an abortion. Or Jesus could have been killed by Herod. Jesus' life, in terms of the circumstances of his birth, accommodated an extraordinary degree of peril, of danger. And danger, we must accept, is at the root of human existence in this world. There is no life free from risk and danger. In fact, we must not even desire that our life be protected from every form of risk and danger. We live not irrespective of, but because the world is full of danger. At the same time, and that's the positive side of it, we're not only placed in a world of risk and danger, we are also endowed with the power, the ability, physical, mental, spiritual, to deal with these circumstances and to prevail over them. And when we do so, our life becomes adventurous and we attain a higher degree of what psychologists call individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming a full-fledged human being, and that process necessarily involves suffering, risk and danger. Now, for example, in South India, in the state of Tamil Nadu, there is a world famous medical college that's called Christian Medical College, Vellore. If you know the story of that medical college, you will know that its birth is in the pain of a woman in labor. A young American lady, barely 18 years of age, happened to come to a place called Tindivanam in Tamil Nadu just to be with her parents who were missionaries in India. Her mother was ill. She came to nurse her mother. And then she happened to see the dead bodies of 3 young women who died in labor being carried off. That day she changed her mind and she decided to become a missionary doctor in India, particularly to help women whose health needs were not met at that time. So the birth of perhaps the largest medical college in Asia is in the crucible of the pain and helplessness of the women of Tamil Nadu. Likewise, the birth, if you know the history of public health as a concept, the birth of public health takes place in the context of the vast suffering of humanity, particularly the European context, on account of the Black Death or the bubonic plague. So that's when the idea of public health comes to the fore. So if you look at any aspect of human progress, you will see medical science would not have progressed, medical science would not have come into being but for the reality of suffering and the need to alleviate the suffering. So the one universal truth that's reflected in these circumstances of the birth of Jesus Christ is the reality of risk, pain, suffering, etc. The fact that human life exists in a context of real danger. The next important aspect that I see reflected in the life of Jesus Christ is that someone has to pay for our life. So this is something that we often forget, and particularly young people tend to forget it. We are alive because someone else has paid for it, and that first and foremost are our mothers, but not only our mothers. Many paid in advance with their struggle, effort, suffering, and some even with their life, in order that we may live as well as we live today. But we take all this for granted. Now, for example, I use a computer. In fact, all my work is accomplished on a keyboard. I do not write, which is not a good thing. I do not use a pen. So I'm not a writer, basically I'm a typist. In publishing about 20 books, I was not a writer, I was a typist. But each time I use the computer, I'm reminded of the millions and millions of people who worked, toiled, day in and day out, to invent the computer, to create the software program, to perfect it, to create the World Wide Web, and all the thousands and thousands of apps that have been developed. If you look into the incredible, mind-boggling amount of labor that has gone into it, all that's available to me at my fingertip. Now, I'm not aware of, I need to be aware of, these millions of man-hours invested into making my life or my effort as easy as it happens to be now. So I need to therefore experience a sense of gratitude. So humanity even today continue to benefit from the suffering of a woman called Mary, and that's the reason why we cannot forget her. And then that inaugurates a life of suffering, Jesus Christ, which comes to a climax on the cross of Calvary. So if you look at the salvific history that we cherish as the life and work of Jesus Christ, you will know that its most dominant note is the note of suffering. And yet, for some strange reason, as human beings, Christians as human beings, and I can understand that, believe that the best thing in the world is to live a life free of suffering, and if possible also of struggle. So now such an expectation is not realistic. We have to accept the fact that just as we have inherited the fruits of the labor, the struggle and suffering of others, we also need to struggle for the sake of others, and we need to make our life fruitful in order to enrich the life of others. The third important insight that I get from the circumstances of the birth of Jesus Christ is that our life involves a great deal more than what we are aware of. For example, Jesus was born in a cattle shed in Bethlehem, but that's not just a kind of story that began all of a sudden. There's a whole background to it. And not only that, when that event happens, there is a wonderful response to that event. For example, in the far distance, the wise men of the east, the Magi, were at that time studying the movement of celestial bodies. They who were at work, they notice the appearance of a special star. They move towards Bethlehem. The shepherds move towards the manger. The news reaches Herod's palace. And before that, the need for Mary to travel to Bethlehem arose because of an edict, an order by Caesar in Rome. If you look at it, all sorts of forces are coming into interplay. Now think of this little baby being laid in the manger, being connected to the distant star in the firmament, and then to the wise men at a great distance, to the shepherds who are far closer, to the royal palace. Of course, from this picture, interestingly enough, the one element that is conspicuously absent is the presence of the priestly class and the religious hierarchy. So, our life includes a very broad canvas of realities, of interacting forces and possibilities. And as psychologists will tell us, we are not just vertical silos. We carry with us the entire race, the entire human race, right? So as the dictum goes, the individual is in the race and the race is in the individual. As Carl Jung pointed out, each individual carries deep down in his own psyche the what he calls the collective unconscious, which comprises the experiences of the human species perhaps from the dawn of history. So we are not just sort of single atoms floating here and there. We are firmly lodged, we are embedded, we are woven into the fabric of humanity from start to finish. That's a kind of larger sense in which we need to understand our place and significance in the continuing story of human beings, of humanity. The next thing I want to highlight is that I'm particularly moved by the fact that this holy babe, and it's a thought that sometimes moves me to tears, this holy babe in all its purity and innocence, life radiating purity and innocence, is placed in a manger. See, Christians have heard this expression for a long time. The holy babe in a manger, the holy babe in a manger. So much so, they overlook or they become oblivious to the fact that the manger is a trough where food for animals is kept. To me, it's a very profound and sobering symbol. What does it mean? This holy babe begins his life, his adventure in the world, virtually as a food for animals. But then, if you remember some of the things I've already shared with you in previous sessions, you will remember that there is a very profound spiritual relevance to this, and that is human beings begin at the level of animal life. At the point of the birth of a human being and the birth of a calf, for example, if anything, the calf is superior to a human being because it's far more adequate to live than a human baby is. So the rock bottom of being human is the animal state, and all of our life, both individually and collectively, is a struggle to emerge from that animal state and to grow towards and attain a far higher state, and that's what we call human destiny. So the life of Jesus Christ begins at the rock bottom of all life, which is the animal state, and it's from that state that we need to emerge. And look at the profound symbolism here. At birth, Jesus is food for animals. That is symbolically, in terms of the contextual nuances, the babe being placed in the manger being trough for the food of animals. And finally, where does he end up? He ends up on the cross of Calvary, where he becomes food for humanity. And that is the amazing story of Jesus Christ. He begins by being food for animals, at least suggestively, but he ends up as the spiritual food for humanity for all times to come. This is the amazing journey, and I can't think of anything or think of this in terms anything less than divine. So this is why I'm really very excited about studying these aspects. For example, when Jesus began his public ministry, John the Baptist saw him as the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And then on the eve of his passion, his suffering and death, Jesus celebrates that fellowship meal with his disciples. He takes a loaf of bread, breaks it, and turns that into a sacrament of his life. And that sacrament of life is perfected on the cross of Calvary. So that's what I mean by the transformation of the food for animals into the eternal nourishment of the human species. So this is the farthest reach of the spiritual imagination of the species to which we belong. And that must be truly, and that is to me, very, very exciting. Furthermore, as compared to the state, as compared to the role that the state, with Caesar in Rome as its fountainhead, as compared to the presence of and the role that the state plays in the story of Jesus' birth, religion is conspicuously absent. This is something that I have a hard time persuading my fellow Christians to even recognize, much less understand. Most people are traumatized at the thought that there is no place for religion in the narrative, or what's called the nativity narrative, the narrative or the account of the birth of Jesus Christ. So, religion really plays no role as religion. I mean, the whole event is divine, the whole event encapsulates the hope of humanity, as I've just now described, howsoever inadequately. However, the trappings of religion are conspicuous by their absence. Now, this is something extremely significant, because this is of a piece with how Jesus envisaged and carried out his public ministry. There was nothing ostentatiously or even obviously religious about anything that Jesus did. He went about meeting the needs of people, ministering to people in their distress, and at the same time unveiling the glorious hope of humanity in the midst of that darkness and gloom. There's nothing religious about this. Everything about this is universal. Everything about this is quintessentially human, quintessentially divine. And that has been reduced to a very, very narrow religious framework with, alas, very unfortunate consequences. So, can you imagine today an event of any religious significance without the high priest being present? Can you really imagine such a thing? Yet, 2000 years ago, on God's initiative, such a thing happened. And that is the challenge that Christians need to wake up to. So, let's proceed. The next important thing that strikes me as especially significant is in the birth of Jesus Christ, and particularly focusing on the predicament of the Blessed Mother, Mary, and also, of course, the vulnerable baby. The mother and the babe share one thing in common, that is extreme vulnerability, extreme, unimaginable, unspeakable vulnerability. Now, if you focus on that, one important truth comes to the fore that needs to be mentioned, and that is, whether it is 2000 years ago or whether it is now, whether you are living in a technologically backward culture, society, or in a highly developed society, as regards the core human predicament, that is to say, in crisis situations, you are utterly alone, and all this elaborate network of scientific, technological, materialistic props that human beings have created and are very proud of, all these things pale into insignificance. Well, when COVID struck us, what was our refuge? Did the state or the governments help us? Did religion help us? No, each individual was left alone. We had to fend for ourselves. And I have very wonderful, exhilarating memories of how I fought COVID. That's perhaps something I may have to reserve for a future occasion. All I can tell you is that I was all alone, all alone. The state had nothing to offer to me. The religious establishment had nothing to offer to me. Yes, my sense of godliness was a great help. But also, my sense of responsibility concerning myself, the duty I have to take care of myself, and therefore the discipline that I need to maintain in order to take care of myself, the discipline that touches all three dimensions of my life. And only during crisis situations do we realize that we need to take good care of all the three dimensions of our life, and therefore it was during COVID-19 that the truth of Jesus' teaching that we need to really aim at life in all its fullness, and nothing less. Life in all its fullness is possible only when we take good care, I would say excellent care, of all the three dimensions of our life, which is not what we do. And that's the reason why, as T.S. Eliot says in one of his in his drama, verse drama, Murder in the Cathedral, living and partly living. So think of Mary in her hour of need. I would say in the excruciating hour of a perilous need, there was no help. The greatest of the empires till then existed at a great distance. The high priest, the priestly class, the Sanhedrin, the entire religious establishment existed at an inaccessible distance. Both of them were irrelevant to her predicament. And this is the reality. But we embrace a world of illusions and delusions concerning all of this and assume that they are indispensable in our life, and when we are in trouble, the agencies and resources of these establishments will come to our aid. It's a myth. It doesn't work like that. Therefore, what is the message that the story of the birth of Jesus Christ brings to us? Grow within yourself. Empower and equip yourself. Become stronger within yourself. You have incredible possibilities and potentialities. For God's sake, develop your possibilities, your strengths, your talents, your abilities. Nothing can take its place. So ultimately, Mary had to dig deeper and deeper into her own personal resources, but that included her unwavering, unshakable faith in God. God to whom she surrendered herself. She said, "Behold your handmaiden. Let it happen to me according to your will." Once you reach that stage, that's a stage of awesome strength. You can face all of this without flinching. That's the positive message that I read in this particular moving story of the birth of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, there is this very empowering message that an individual can attain significance not because of the mercy of circumstances, but in spite of them. In spite of them. And that is the challenging message in the life and the birth and public ministry of Jesus Christ. My dear friends, can you imagine a beginning less promising, less hope-giving, and more scary than the beginning of Jesus' life? And see at the same time what all possibilities were unveiled in course of time. So no other person perhaps became as significant. I don't want to sort of say this to the derogation of the founders of other religions. I'm not in the business of comparing religions and playing up one against the other. I think that's very ungodly. But I'm talking about the particular story, the entire story of the Bible. No other person in the biblical history comes anywhere near Jesus Christ. No king, no ruler of the Jews, no high priest, no military ruler, no judge comes anywhere near Jesus Christ. Now this is, to me, a vastly empowering insight that the scope and significance of our life do not have to be determined by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. After all, these circumstances are not of our making. And we are not mere clay in the hands of the forces external to us to be shaped according to their will. If we believe in God, if we have faith in God, faith is the power that we can assume to take charge of our life in partnership with God so as to shape it to its full potential, to its full glory. That's the triumphant aspect of faith. So when the Bible says that in Jesus Christ we are victorious, please understand that we are victorious because Jesus Christ is the author and perfecter of our faith. And therefore what it means is that if we live according to the discipline and excitement of faith, then we will triumph over, we will prevail, or we will surmount the limitations of the circumstances of our birth, and we'll attain to a significance of life that would be a miracle in the eyes not only of others but even of ourselves. Okay? This has happened in our midst, and it's marvelous in our own eyes. That's what. See? So, this is something that we need to really remind ourselves of from time to time, or rather cherish in our hearts, to our encouragement and empowerment. So, therefore, the positive message from this is that we need to grow in our faith, true faith, as against some kind of parochial denominational set of assumptions, faith in some tradition, some rituals, some dogmas, faith in the living God who is with us at all times and who is an inexhaustible and unfailing source of power. Now, furthermore, the deprivation that we experience may well be, and this is something paradoxical but is very true, the deprivation that seems to be sort of pressing itself upon us due to the circumstances of our life. You can't imagine a birth in a worse state of deprivation than the birth of Jesus Christ, to be born in a cattle shed, deprived of all health facilities, services, even the help of an untrained midwife. Now, the thing is, there is another aspect to this, and that is, this could also be an advantage. I'm not saying that not having the amenities of life is an advantage in itself. What I'm saying is that if you really analyze the essence of the state, what it means is that Jesus is born outside the framework of organized social, economic, cultural, political network or the establishment, right? Now, we do not realize the extent to which we are socially, culturally, politically conditioned. We are conditioned by the world. The world penetrates us. Now, I've been in the field of education, and I have always been a little disturbed at the extent to which individuals are conditioned by this process of education, and being thus conditioned is or involves or implies a state of unfreedom. In fact, it could well be the case that the native genius of individuals is crippled by the kind of education that they receive. If you are too conditioned in the given, then you will be crippled in relation to the new things that can possibly emerge through you. That is why the world of academia sometimes proves very barren, fruitless, because academics are hardwired in the given, and therefore they progressively lose the capacity to be original. Now, I'm reminded here of what Arthur Schopenhauer said about professors of philosophy. He said that academic philosophy killed philosophy. Why? Because he said academic philosophers are incapable of original philosophizing. Of course, Immanuel Kant would be an example. He's one of the earliest academic philosophers, but he was only a private tutor. The philosophers of Athens were not professors, because they taught, from Socrates onwards, they taught people, but in a very different sense. They taught what they discovered. Professors of philosophy simply recycle what other philosophers discovered for themselves. So, Schopenhauer said that professors of philosophy can never be philosophers. They can only stick labels, newfangled names, to old philosophical insights which they borrow from others. Well, much remains to be said on this, but the fact is, and that's where this is helpful to our argument, that being conditioned in a hard way or being hardwired according to the existing patterns, the pattern of the world, can have a crippling effect in terms of the original contributions that a person can make. And therefore, for example, too much of religiosity is bad because it makes us blind to the newer interventions of God. Too much of theology is bad because it prevents us from thinking and experiencing the living God afresh. So, in this light, if you look at how Jesus was born completely outside the framework of organized life, as is denoted by the world of animals, Jesus being born in a cattle shed, was it an advantage or a disadvantage? I would think that it was a great advantage because Jesus was not conditioned. Jesus was not conditioned by the reigning stereotypes of his days, the stereotypes of culture, the stereotypes of politics, and above all the stereotypes of religion. And this is how I understand the significance of the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Now let me make a brief mention of this. It's a war subject. Why did Jesus have to be born in this manner? Now surely the idea of the virgin birth, today of course it is at the zenith of our religious awareness. But please understand, 2000 years ago, it was a religious scandal. As per the religiosity of the Jews, Mary should have been stoned to death. So, the idea of the virgin birth, Jesus being born to a virgin, is practically speaking the idea of shaking Jesus loose or liberating Jesus from the shackles of established religion. Jesus was not born within the framework of the established religion at all. And that is the main reason, the practical reason why Jesus exemplified a remarkable, astonishing degree of religious freedom. Freedom from religion. That's to me religious freedom. It is freedom of religion is universally now understood as freedom to conform to a particular religion. No, if you look at freedom of religion in the life of Jesus Christ, it is freedom from religion, freedom from the tyranny of religious practices and patterns. And that's the only reason why a new light could emerge on the horizon of human hope. This is something that Christians refuse to understand. And unless and until you understand it, you cannot begin to be a Christian. So, Jesus being born outside the framework of the organized life was a great advantage. Though we think rather sentimentally of this. Oh, poor Jesus. Look at the way he was born. No, it was necessary. It was in the wise and beautiful plan of God. I cannot think of Jesus being born in a palace. I cannot even imagine Jesus being born in a middle class family. Well, frankly speaking, I cannot even imagine Jesus being born in the family of a daily wage worker who was pious, religiously conformist in the sense in which we practice it. And therefore, in this context, please remember the second verse of the 12th chapter of Paul's letter to Romans, where he says, do not conform to the pattern of the world, but rather be transformed. Now that pattern of the world includes the pattern of religion also. Make no doubt about it. And it is Jesus who, more than anybody else, demonstrates to us the critical importance and the irreducible need to be non-conformist in relation to the stereotypes of religion and the set patterns and practices thereof. So it was to Jesus' great disadvantage, and it was to the incredible benefit of humanity, therefore, that Jesus was born in the kind of circumstances which otherwise seem rather piteous and pathetic, that Jesus was born. Outside the framework of the established order is the only possibility that a new order may come into being. I repeat, It's only outside the boundaries of the rigidly hardwired establishment. Is there any chance that a new system or a new way of life come into being? You cannot produce this new way of life. You cannot evolve the vision of the kingdom of God out of the old. The high priest of Judaism, no matter how inspired he is, cannot proclaim the kingdom of God. He can only proclaim Judaism. He can only be on the vigil to persecute and liquidate those who, in his opinion, are threats to the religious establishment over which he is duty bound to preside. So this is something that I cannot exaggerate. I cannot even explain adequately. This is something so profound, so important, so critically important, and I pray that my viewers would continue to engage with this important aspect. Now let me give you a sort of historical illustration. So Dr. Johnson was the literary giant of the 18th century. Even if you're not familiar with the writings of Dr. Johnson, it doesn't matter. His biographer was Boswell. So Dr. Johnson, he studied at Eton, one of the leading public schools, which produced the literary geniuses of the times, Harrow, Eton, that kind of thing. So one day, Dr. Johnson casually mentioned Boswell. He said, Boswell, when others were studying hard, I was rolling down the meadows of Eton. What Dr. Johnson perhaps meant was that he did not allow his native genius to be crippled and conditioned by this educational hard wiring that most other people sort of tamely submitted themselves to. And this is also said about George Bernard Shaw, by the way, the reason why he has a very unique imagination and a remarkable extent of intellectual freedom. There is much to be said on this pattern, about this pattern, even outside of the religious context. So, let me conclude therefore our reflections on these peculiar circumstances in which Jesus Christ was born. Each one of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle falls in the right place. Everything has its God-appointed place and meaning. It's up to us to reflect upon, to understand, and to be equipped, empowered, and encouraged by these amazing things that God has woven into the tapestry of the unique birth of Jesus Christ. I commend these reflections to all my friends who are sharing this journey of faith with me in order to understand the deeper meanings in the teachings of Jesus Christ. It's a privilege for me to share my heart and my life with all of you. And I want to acknowledge that there is no privilege that I cherish higher than the privilege of understanding the teachings of Jesus Christ, at least in a limited way, and sharing that with all who may care to lend their ears to it. Thank you very much and have a very blessed day.